Murder at Marigold Hill by Catherine Waltan. Chapter 1. The Invitation. On an ordinary Tuesday morning in late September, when the maple leaves outside Helen Lighthall's kitchen window had just begun their slow dance toward gold, she received an invitation that made her pause mid-sip of Earl Grey tea. Not because of its elegant script or cream-colored paper, though both were undeniably fine, but because of the way Shadow, her dignified black Labrador, lifted his head from his morning nap and stared at the envelope as if it had personally offended him. Helen set down her teacup with the careful precision of a woman who had spent 30 years measuring ingredients to the gram, and examined the mysterious correspondence. The envelope bore no postmark, no stamp, just her name written in flowing copper plate, Mrs. Helen Lighthall, Maplewood. The paper felt substantial beneath her fingers, the kind that cost more per sheet than most people spent on lunch. "Hand-delivered, then," she murmured to her canine companions. Halo, her eternally optimistic yellow lab, thumped his tail hopefully from his spot near the stove, always ready to greet unexpected visitors, even postal ones. Shadow, however, remained skeptical, his dark eyes fixed on the envelope, with the intensity he usually reserved for suspicious strangers and vacuum cleaners. The wax seal caught the morning light as Helen turned it over, a stylized marigold, its petals picked out in gold leaf. Pretty, she admitted, but also oddly formal for their small Connecticut town, where most invitations came via text message or shouted across the grocery store aisles. She cracked the seal with her thumbnail, releasing the faint scent of orange blossoms, an affectation that would have made her laugh, if not for the growing certainty that this particular piece of mail was about to complicate her carefully ordered retirement. The card inside was thick as a tea biscuit and twice as pretentious. Helen adjusted her reading glasses and began, "Ms. Lighthall. Marigold Hill Estate, newly restored after decades of neglect, will open its doors this weekend for a small gathering of Maplewood's most interesting minds. Come prepared for stimulating conversation, spirited debate, and the company of rarities, some botanical, some bibliographical, all quite fascinating. Saturday through Monday. Private rooms have been assigned. Transportation will be provided at 3 o'clock sharp. Dogs most welcome. Edward March." Helen read it twice, then set the card on her kitchen counter beside the cooling rack of cranberry scones she'd pulled from the oven an hour earlier. Edward March. She knew the name, though they'd never been properly introduced. He'd published a coffee table book about local history some years back, Forgotten Estates of New England, the sort with glossy photographs and reverential text about architectural heritage and preservation of legacy. She'd thumbed through it at the library, admiring the pictures while finding the writing rather bloodless. What she remembered most clearly was that Edward March had purchased Marigold Hill 3 years ago, paying what the town assessor had delicately termed a substantial sum for a property that had been slowly surrendering to ivy and neglect since the 1970s. The restoration had been the subject of much local speculation, crews arriving at dawn, supply trucks navigating the narrow mountain road, and Edward himself occasionally spotted in the village market, always polite but never lingering for conversation. "Interesting minds," Helen said aloud, testing the phrase. "I wonder if that's a compliment or a warning." She flipped the invitation over, where additional details were written in the same careful hand. Guest list, Mrs. Camilla Rowan, Snapdragon Studio, Mrs. Hazel Pym, Sweetleaf Tea House, Mr. Victor Bellamy, Development Consultant, Professor Alistair Finch, Visiting Scholar, Boston University, Miss May Delaney, Herbalist, Mrs. Helen Lighthall, Problem Solver Extraordinaire. Sheriff Michael Arrington has graciously consented to join us, purely as a friend, and for my own peace of mind. Helen's eyebrows rose. Half the names were familiar, pillars of Maplewood's small but vibrant community. Camilla ran the art studio where Helen had taken a disastrous pottery class the previous spring. Hazel's tea shop was where half the town's business got conducted over perfectly brewed Earl Grey and gossip. May was Helen's dearest friend, a retired nurse turned herbalist who could coax healing properties from the most unlikely plants. But Victor Bellamy made her pause. She'd heard that name in less flattering contexts. A developer with interests in modernizing various historic properties around the county. The kind of man who saw a 19th century farmhouse and envisioned a strip mall. And then there was Mike, Sheriff Michael Arrington, recently widowed, eternally patient, and the closest thing Helen had to... Well, she wasn't quite ready to define what Mike was to her, but his presence at this gathering suggested Edward March was expecting more than philosophical debates about rare books. "Problem solver extraordinaire," she repeated, shaking her head. "How does a man I've never met know about my... hobbies?" Shadow's ears flicked forward, and he padded to the window overlooking the garden. Halo followed, both dogs suddenly alert in that particular way that meant they'd detected something Helen's merely human senses had missed. She joined them at the window, peering through the gauze curtains. Her small backyard was peaceful, late roses nodding in their beds, the herb garden she'd planted in spring growing thick and fragrant, a pair of cardinals taking turns at the bird feeder. Nothing unusual. Yet the dogs remained tense, Shadow's hackles slightly raised, Halo's tail motionless for the first time all morning. "What is it, boys?" Helen asked softly. As if in answer, a shadow detached itself from the oak tree at the far edge of her property, too tall for a squirrel, too purposeful for a random passerby. For just a moment, Helen caught the impression of someone watching her house, watching her, before the figure melted back into the dappled shade and disappeared. The dogs relaxed, returning to their respective napping spots. But Helen remained at the window, invitation still in hand, a familiar prickle of unease settling between her shoulder blades. In her experience, invitations that came with watchers in the woods were rarely about stimulating conversation and rare books. They were about secrets that someone desperately wanted to keep buried or expose. She returned to the kitchen table and read the invitation a third time, this time noting what it didn't say as much as what it did. No mention of why this particular group had been assembled, no explanation of what made them interesting, no details about what exactly they would be viewing or discussing. And that postscript about Sheriff Arrington being there for peace of mind suggested Edward March was expecting trouble. Helen reached for her phone and scrolled to Mike's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the slightly harried tone of a man dealing with Tuesday morning's inevitable parade of minor crises. "Arrington. Mike, it's Helen. Did you get an interesting piece of mail today?" A pause. "Depends on your definition of interesting. If you mean an invitation to spend the weekend at a mysterious estate with a group of people who may or may not want to murder each other, then yes." Helen smiled despite her growing unease. "So, you're going?" "Are you?" She glanced at the dogs, both now watching her with the patient attention they reserved for moments when important decisions were being made. Shadow's dark eyes seemed to say be careful, while Halo's expression was more along the lines of new people to meet and possibly treats to acquire. "I think I am," she said finally. "My curiosity has gotten the better of my common sense. Again." "Then I'll definitely be there," Mike replied. "Someone needs to keep you out of trouble." "I don't go looking for trouble," Helen protested. "No," Mike agreed, "but it seems to have your address." After they hung up, Helen spent the afternoon baking, her usual response to anxiety. By evening, her kitchen counter was loaded with fresh bread, a batch of lemon bars that had turned out particularly well, and a tin of ginger snaps that she'd wrapped in cellophane as a potential hostess gift. Cooking centered her, the familiar rhythms of measuring and mixing, providing a counterpoint to the questions circling her mind. Who was Edward March, really? What was the true purpose of this gathering? And why did she have the persistent feeling that accepting his invitation was like stepping onto a stage where someone else had already written the final act? As twilight settled over Maplewood, Helen packed a small overnight bag with the efficiency of someone who had learned to travel light. A change of clothes, her reading glasses, the mystery novel she'd been meaning to finish, and a few basic toiletries. She added the tin of ginger snaps, and after a moment's hesitation, the small digital camera she'd bought on impulse last Christmas and never used. Something told her she might want to document whatever she was about to encounter at Marigold Hill. The dogs watched her preparations with growing excitement. Halo had already stationed himself by the front door, tail wagging, while Shadow maintained his more dignified vigil from the hallway. Both had learned to recognize the signs of an adventure brewing. "Well, boys," Helen said, scratching behind Shadow's ears, "it looks like we're about to find out what happens when Maplewood's most interesting minds gather in one place." Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, his version of cautious optimism. Outside, the September evening was cool and clear, stars just beginning to emerge against the darkening sky. Helen stood on her front porch for a moment, breathing in the familiar scents of her neighborhood, wood smoke from someone's early fireplace, the last roses of the season, the faint aroma of pasta sauce drifting from the Kowalski house next door. Peaceful, normal, safe. Tomorrow, she would trade all of that for the unknown quantities of Marigold Hill and its mysterious host. As she locked her front door and set the alarm, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that she was also locking the door on her quiet, predictable life, at least temporarily. The invitation lay on her kitchen counter, the gold marigold seal catching the last rays of afternoon sunlight. Beautiful, elegant, and somehow ominous, like a flower that bloomed most brilliantly just before it revealed its thorns. Helen Lighthall, problem solver extraordinaire, was about to discover just how sharp those thorns could be. Chapter 2: Secrets in the Walls. The sedan that arrived at Helen's cottage at precisely 3 o'clock was the sort of vehicle that whispered wealth rather than shouting it, midnight blue with chrome that caught the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. The driver, a lean man in his 40s wearing a chauffeur's cap at a respectful angle, emerged to greet her with the practiced deference of someone accustomed to ferrying nervous passengers to uncertain destinations. "Mrs. Lighthall? I'm Henry Caulfield. Mr. March sent me to collect you and your companions." His eyes crinkled at the corners as he took in Shadow and Halo, who were conducting their usual careful inspection of any newcomer. "Beautiful dogs. Mr. March mentioned they'd be joining us." Helen noted the way Henry spoke, educated, with the faint trace of an accent she couldn't quite place. Not the usual hire from the local car service, then. This was someone Edward March trusted with more than just driving duties. "They're my security detail," Helen said lightly, though she meant it more than Henry could know. "Shadow's the brains, Halo's the charm." Henry's smile was genuine as he opened the rear door. "I suspect Mr. March will appreciate both qualities before the weekend's through." The interior of the sedan was all leather and subtle luxury, with enough space for both dogs to settle comfortably on the bench seat opposite Helen. As they pulled away from her cottage, she watched Maplewood's familiar streetscape roll past, the library where she'd spent countless quiet afternoons, the bakery where she'd worked for 3 decades, the small park where she walked the dogs every morning. Such an ordinary little town, she reflected, yet somehow it kept producing extraordinary mysteries. "How long have you worked for Mr. March?" Helen asked as they turned onto the highway leading toward the hills. "About 2 years since he purchased the estate," Henry replied, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. "He's an interesting employer, passionate about history, particularly the darker corners that most people prefer to forget." "And you help him explore those corners?" Henry's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "I help him research, yes, though I sometimes wonder if certain stones are better left unturned." Before Helen could ask what he meant, they were turning off the main road onto a narrow lane that wound upward through stands of maple and oak. The trees had begun their autumn transformation, leaves edged with gold and crimson. But there was something about the quality of light filtering through them that felt different from the cheerful fall colors in town. Darker, more watchful. Shadow lifted his head, nose working, while Halo pressed closer to the window with unusual intensity. Both dogs had gone quiet in that particular way that meant they were processing information Helen couldn't access. "The estate's been empty for over 40 years, Henry continued, perhaps trying to fill the suddenly heavy silence. Amazing what neglect can do to a place. And what money can undo, of course." They crested a hill, and Marigold Hill Estate spread before them like something from a Gothic novel. The main house was a sprawling Victorian mansion, all towers and gables and wraparound porches, freshly painted in shades of cream and sage green. Gardens stepped down the hillside in carefully maintained terraces, and outbuildings dotted the property like satellites orbiting a distant planet. It was undeniably beautiful. It was also deeply unsettling in a way Helen couldn't articulate. "Impressive restoration," she said carefully. Mr. March spared no expense, Henry agreed. He wanted everything returned to exactly how it was in 1925. Before... He trailed off, seeming to catch himself. Before what? Henry pulled into the circular drive, gravel crunching beneath the tires with a sound like breaking glass. Before the tragedy, Mrs. Lighthall. Every old house has its ghosts, but Marigold Hills are particularly persistent. Other vehicles were already parked near the front entrance: Mike's familiar pickup truck, a sleek silver BMW that probably belonged to Victor Bellamy, and May's ancient but lovingly maintained Volvo. Helen felt a flutter of relief at seeing her friend's car. May's presence would provide an anchor of normalcy in whatever strangeness lay ahead. The front door opened before they'd finished climbing the stone steps, revealing a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair and the intense eyes of someone who collected secrets the way other people collected stamps. Edward March wore a perfectly tailored tweed jacket and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Lighthall!" He grasped her hands in both of his, as if they were old friends meeting after a long separation. "I cannot tell you how pleased I am that you accepted my invitation. The house has been positively humming with anticipation." An odd thing to say about a building, Helen thought, but she smiled politely. "Thank you for including me, Mr. March. Though I confess I'm curious about what qualifies me as one of Maplewood's interesting minds." "Oh, my dear woman," Edward laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "Your reputation precedes you. The woman who solved the Snapdragon Studio murders, who unraveled the mystery at Foxglove Fair, who brought justice to Rosewood Garden. You are exactly the sort of person this house wants to meet." There it was again, that suggestion that the house itself was a participant in whatever Edward had planned. Helen filed the observation away as they were ushered into a foyer that took her breath away. The restoration had been magnificent. A grand staircase curved upward beneath a crystal chandelier that cast rainbow prisms across walls papered in subtle florals. Persian rugs softened the marble floor, and fresh flowers, marigolds of course, filled tall vases on every available surface. But beneath the beauty, Helen sensed something else. A heaviness in the air, as if the house remembered things it would rather forget. The dogs felt it too. Shadow's hackles were slightly raised, while Halo stuck close to Helen's side instead of bounding off to explore, as was his usual custom. "The other guests are gathering in the drawing room," Edward said, leading them down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced Victorians. "We're just waiting for Professor Finch to arrive from Boston, and then we can begin properly." The drawing room buzzed with quiet conversation, the guests clustering in small groups like particles seeking equilibrium. Helen immediately spotted May near the fireplace, her silver hair twisted into its usual neat bun, wearing the kind of practical cardigan that had probably been in her wardrobe since the Carter administration. Their eyes met across the room, and May's slight nod conveyed volumes. "Something's not right here, but we'll figure it out together." Mike stood near the tall windows overlooking the gardens, his sheriff's uniform replaced by civilian clothes that somehow made him look more rather than less authoritative. He caught Helen's eye and tapped his watch, their agreed-upon signal that he was already cataloging potential problems. Camilla Rowan was perched on a velvet settee, her artist's eye taking in every detail of the room's furnishings. Victor Bellamy held court near the bar cart, his expensive suit and practiced smile not quite concealing the calculating look in his eyes as he surveyed the other guests. And Hazel Pym sat ramrod straight in a wing chair, teacup balanced perfectly in her lap, her expression suggesting she was already composing mental reviews of the hospitality. "Now then," Edward clapped his hands together, drawing everyone's attention. "Welcome all of you to Marigold Hill. I know you must be curious about why I've brought you together, and I promise all will be revealed in due time. But first, let me show you to your rooms so you can freshen up before dinner. As they followed Edward up the grand staircase, Helen noticed details that hadn't been visible from below. The wallpaper, while beautifully restored, couldn't quite hide water stains along the wainscoting. Several of the portrait frames were slightly askew, as if they'd been recently moved and imperfectly repositioned. And there was a door on the second-floor landing that bore a small brass plate reading "Private," in letters that looked much newer than the rest of the hardware. "Your room overlooks the south garden," Edward told Helen as he opened a door near the end of the hallway. "I thought you might appreciate the view." The room was lovely, all florals and antiques and carefully curated charm. French doors opened onto a small balcony where Helen could indeed see the garden Edward had mentioned. But what caught her attention wasn't the formal flower beds or the ornamental fountain. It was the way Shadow immediately went to the window and began what could only be described as standing guard. "Is everything all right?" Edward asked, noticing her distraction. "Just getting our bearings," Helen replied. "It's quite a magnificent restoration. You must be very proud." "I am," Edward said, but something flickered across his face, an expression too quick to read, but too deliberate to be accidental. "Though I sometimes wonder if the house appreciates our efforts to bring it back to life. Old places can be resistant to change." After he left, Helen unpacked while the dogs conducted their own inspection of the room. Their behavior was unusual. Instead of claiming the most comfortable spots and settling in for naps, they remained alert, ears pricked, occasionally exchanging glances as if conducting a silent conversation about their surroundings. Helen had learned to trust their instincts. If Shadow and Halo were unsettled, there was good reason for it. She was hanging her spare dress in the antique wardrobe when her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small leather journal wedged behind the hanging rod. She pulled it out carefully, noting its age and the initials embossed on the cover, CM. The journal fell open to a page marked with a dried flower, a marigold, its petals brown with age. The entry was dated October 15th, 1925. "The dreams have returned, worse than before. Mother says I'm being fanciful, but I know what I've seen in the garden. The soil remembers what was buried there, and it won't stay quiet much longer. Father speaks of sending me away for my health, but running won't change what I know. Someone in this house is responsible for what happened to poor Clara, and they'll kill again to keep their secret safe." Helen's pulse quickened. Clara, the same name Henry had mentioned when he spoke of the estate's tragedy. She flipped through more pages, finding increasingly frantic entries about suspicious deaths, covered-up accidents, and a family conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local society. The final entry was dated October 20th, 1925. "I've hidden the evidence where they'll never think to look. If something happens to me, let this journal stand as testimony. The truth is in the garden, beneath the marigolds. God forgive us all for what we've allowed to flourish in this house of secrets." A soft knock at her door interrupted her reading. Helen quickly tucked the journal into her overnight bag as May's voice called from the hallway. "Helen, are you ready for dinner?" "Coming," Helen replied, her mind racing. As she opened the door to greet her friend, she couldn't shake the feeling that the weekend's true purpose had just revealed itself, and it had nothing to do with stimulating conversation or rare books. Edward March hadn't invited them here to celebrate the estate's restoration. He'd brought them here to witness its reckoning. And somewhere in the walls of Marigold Hill, a century-old secret was stirring, ready to bloom again in ways that might prove deadly for them all. Chapter 3: A Stranger in the Garden. Helen woke before dawn, not from any sound, but from the peculiar quality of silence that seemed to press against the windows of Marigold Hill, like something alive and patient. The antique clock on the mantelpiece showed 5:30, its brass hands catching the first pale threads of morning light that filtered through the heavy curtains. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house breathe around her. Old buildings had their own rhythms, the settling of floorboards, the whisper of air through hidden gaps, the distant murmur of pipes carrying water to forgotten corners. But this silence felt different, expectant, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Shadow stood at the French doors leading to the balcony, his silhouette rigid against the growing light. His ears were pricked forward in that particular way that meant he'd detected something worth investigating. Halo lay stretched across the foot of the ornate four-poster bed, but even in sleep his legs twitched as if he were running through dreams that weren't entirely pleasant. Helen slipped from beneath the down comforter, her bare feet finding the cold hardwood floors. The journal she'd discovered the night before seemed to pulse with significance from her overnight bag, its final entry echoing in her mind. The truth is in the garden, beneath the marigolds. She joined Shadow at the glass doors, peering down into the south garden that spread below her balcony. In the pre-dawn gloom, the formal flower beds looked like dark geometric puzzles, their edges softened by mist that rose from the dew-heavy grass. Ornamental trees stood sentinel throughout the space, their branches creating pools of deeper shadow that could hide almost anything. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then Shadow's tail flicked once, his equivalent of pointing, and Helen's eyes found what had captured his attention. A figure moved among the marigold beds at the far end of the garden, barely visible in the uncertain light. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing that made him nearly invisible against the backdrop of evergreen shrubs. He carried something in his hands, a tool of some kind, though from this distance Helen couldn't make out the details. The stranger worked with practiced efficiency, kneeling beside one of the flower beds and using his implement to disturb the soil. Not random vandalism, his movements were too purposeful, too careful. He was looking for something specific, or perhaps burying something he didn't want found. Helen's pulse quickened as she watched him work. Every few moments the man would pause and glance around, scanning the windows of the house as if checking for observers. But he never looked up toward Helen's balcony, perhaps assuming that guests would still be asleep at this early hour. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the stranger straightened and brushed soil from his hands. He gathered his tools and moved toward the edge of the garden, where a gate in the hedge led to the wilder portions of the estate. Within moments, he had vanished into the morning mist like something from a ghost story. Shadow relaxed slightly, though he remained alert. Helen reached down to scratch behind his ears, her mind already working through possibilities. The figure could have been a groundskeeper, of course, except that Edward March had made no mention of staff beyond the housekeeper who had served dinner the night before, and legitimate garden work didn't usually require such stealth or such early hours. No, whoever she'd just observed was operating outside official channels. The question was whether he was connected to the weekend's gathering or represented some entirely separate threat. Helen dressed quickly in practical clothes, dark jeans, a warm sweater, sturdy walking shoes that could handle dewy grass and uncertain terrain. She clipped the dogs' leashes to their collars, noting that both animals seemed more alert than usual, their noses working overtime as if processing scents that told stories Helen couldn't read. The house was tomb quiet as they made their way downstairs, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets and heavy curtains. Helen had memorized the layout during the previous evening's tour, and she found the side door that opened onto the terrace without difficulty. The old lock turned easily under her hand, perhaps too easily for a house that supposedly valued security. The morning air was cool and sweet, carrying the complex perfume of a well-tended garden, roses surrendering their last blooms to autumn, lavender still holding hints of summer warmth, and underneath it all, the rich earthiness of soil that had been recently disturbed. Shadow's nose went immediately to work, leading Helen and Halo down the stone steps toward the formal beds where she'd observed the stranger. The south garden was larger than it had appeared from her window, a series of interconnected spaces divided by low hedges and graveled paths. Someone had spent considerable money restoring it to period accuracy. The plant varieties, the layout, even the style of the benches and statuary all spoke of careful research and meticulous attention to detail. But as they approached the marigold beds, Helen could see clear evidence of the morning's clandestine activity. The soil around several plants had been disturbed, small piles of dark earth scattered on the surrounding grass. Someone had been digging, and recently. Shadow led them to the most heavily disturbed area, where the marigolds grew in neat rows like golden soldiers. The flowers themselves were magnificent, larger and more vibrant than any Helen had seen in ordinary gardens, their petals practically glowing in the strengthening daylight. But beneath their beauty lay something unsettling. The soil around their roots was darker than it should be, almost black, and it gave off a faint metallic smell that made Helen think of old pennies or blood. Halo whined softly and backed away from one particular flower bed, his usual enthusiasm for investigation replaced by obvious reluctance. Shadow was more circumspect, but Helen noticed he kept his nose well away from the disturbed earth, relying on visual observation rather than his usually reliable scenting abilities. "What is it, boys?" Helen murmured, crouching beside the bed where the disturbance was most evident. "What's wrong with this soil?" She didn't expect an answer, of course, but sometimes talking through her observations helped clarify her thinking. The earth here looked almost rich enough to be fertile. Too rich, in fact, as if it had been heavily fertilized with something more substantial than commercial plant food. A memory surfaced from the journal she'd found. The soil remembers what was buried there. Helen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What if the anonymous writer hadn't been speaking metaphorically? What if something, or someone, really was buried beneath these beautiful, unnatural marigolds? The sound of footsteps on gravel made her look up sharply. A man was approaching along the main path, his stride confident but not hurried. As he drew closer, Helen recognized him as the stranger she'd observed from her window, though in the better light she could see details that had been obscured by distance and shadow. He was perhaps 60, with the weathered face and calloused hands of someone who worked outdoors for a living. His clothes were practical: work boots, canvas pants, a jacket that had seen better years. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and there was something in his bearing that suggested he was more than just a simple gardener. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his cap in a gesture that managed to be both polite and slightly mocking. "You're up early for a house guest." "I could say the same about you," Helen replied carefully. "I don't believe we were introduced last night." "That's because I wasn't invited to dinner." His smile was thin, but not entirely unfriendly. "I'm Thomas Whitmore. I've been tending these gardens longer than your host has owned them." Helen filed the name away for later investigation. "Mr. March didn't mention having a groundskeeper." "Mr. March doesn't know about me," Thomas said with obvious satisfaction. "I have an understanding with the land itself. Been keeping an eye on things since before the restoration began." An odd way to phrase it, Helen thought. Most people would say they had an understanding with the property owner, not the land itself. "And what exactly are you keeping an eye on?" Thomas's gaze shifted to the disturbed marigold bed, then back to Helen's face. "Making sure certain things stay buried, making sure others don't dig where they shouldn't." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Helen felt Shadow press against her leg, a warm and reassuring presence. "And you think someone's been digging where they shouldn't?" "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that your host has been asking questions about things that happened long before he was born, questions that might disturb more than just the soil." Before Helen could respond, he touched his cap again and walked away, disappearing around a bend in the path with the same quiet efficiency she'd observed from her window. But his words lingered in the cool morning air like smoke from a distant fire. Helen remained in the garden for another 20 minutes, letting the dogs explore while she processed what she'd learned. Thomas Whitmore claimed to be a guardian of some kind, protecting secrets buried beneath the beautiful flowers. But guardians could be protectors or predators, depending on what they thought needed protecting and from whom. As they headed back toward the house, Helen noticed other details she'd missed in her focus on the mysterious gardener. Several of the garden's ornamental features, benches, statuary, decorative urns, bore dates from the 1920s, the same period as the journal entries she'd found, the same era when someone named Clara had died under mysterious circumstances. The marigolds weren't just flowers, Helen realized. They were a living memorial to whatever tragedy had occurred here nearly a century ago. And if Thomas Whitmore was right, that tragedy might not be as buried as everyone believed. Back in her room, Helen settled at the small writing desk with a cup of coffee she'd retrieved from the breakfast service. The journal lay open before her, its brittle pages filled with increasingly desperate observations about death and conspiracy. But now, having seen the garden and met its self-appointed guardian, the entries felt less like the ravings of an overwrought imagination and more like the careful documentation of someone who knew they were running out of time. She copied key passages into her own notebook, paying particular attention to names and dates. Clara's death in October 1925. The writer's growing certainty that it hadn't been an accident. The suggestion that evidence lay hidden somewhere on the estate. And underneath it all, the recurring theme of marigolds, flowers that bloomed with unnatural vigor in soil that had been enriched by more than fertilizer. A soft knock at her door interrupted her note-taking. "Helen?" May's voice carried a note of concern. "Are you all right? I saw you from my window earlier, walking in the garden." Helen opened the door to find her friend fully dressed despite the early hour, her silver hair neatly arranged, and her sharp eyes bright with curiosity. May had always been an early riser, but there was something in her expression that suggested she hadn't slept well either. "Couldn't sleep," Helen admitted, stepping aside to let May enter. "The house feels restless." May nodded, settling into the room's single armchair with the ease of someone accustomed to making herself comfortable in uncertain situations. "I felt it too, like the walls are holding their breath, waiting for something to happen." Helen poured her friend a cup of coffee from the service that had been left outside her door. "Did you notice anything unusual about our host last night? Or the other guests?" "Edward March is nervous about something," May said without hesitation. "Excited, yes, but underneath that there's fear. And Victor Bellamy." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "That man has the look of someone who's used to getting what he wants, regardless of who gets hurt in the process." Helen settled back at the desk, cradling her warm coffee cup. "May, what do you know about the history of this place, before Edward bought it?" May's expression grew thoughtful. "Old family estate, built in the 1890s, the Marigold family, local aristocracy, if such a thing existed in rural Connecticut. They had money from textile mills, I think, and a reputation for—" She searched for the right word. "Peculiarity. There were stories about strange deaths, family members who disappeared, that sort of thing. But you know how gossip grows in small towns?" "What kind of strange deaths?" "The details were always vague. Accidents that didn't quite make sense. Illnesses that came on too suddenly. Young people dying when they should have lived to be old." May met Helen's eyes. "The kind of deaths that make people whisper about curses and family sins." Helen thought about the journal entries, the disturbed soil, Thomas Whitmore's warnings about things that should stay buried. And the family? What happened to them? "Died out in the 1970s, as far as I know. The last heir was an elderly woman who lived alone here for decades, refusing all offers to sell. When she passed, the estate went to distant relatives who wanted nothing to do with it. That's when it started falling into ruin. Until Edward March came along." "Until Edward March came along," May agreed. "With enough money to restore it, and apparently enough curiosity to want to dig up its secrets." Helen set down her coffee cup, her mind racing with connections and possibilities. Edward hadn't invited them here for a social weekend. He'd assembled a group of people with specific skills and knowledge, including a retired sheriff and a woman with a talent for solving mysteries. He was planning something that might require both law enforcement and investigative expertise. The question was whether he was trying to expose the truth about Marigold Hill's dark history, or whether he was about to become its latest victim. Outside, the morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the gardens in their full restored glory. But beneath the beauty, Helen could feel something stirring, like roots reaching up through poisoned soil toward the light. Whatever secrets lay buried beneath the marigolds, they wouldn't stay hidden much longer. Chapter 4: The Body in the Library. The afternoon had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a well-orchestrated house party. After lunch in the conservatory, where Edward had regaled them with stories of the Restoration's challenges, the guests had dispersed to pursue their various interests. Professor Finch had claimed a quiet corner of the drawing room to examine some of Edward's rare books, while Camilla sketched architectural details from the main staircase. Victor and Hazel had engaged in what appeared to be a spirited debate about municipal zoning laws, their voices carrying from the terrace in tones of barely civilized disagreement. Helen had spent the early afternoon walking the estate's perimeter with Shadow and Halo, noting details that hadn't been visible during her morning encounter with Thomas Whitmore. The property was larger than it appeared from the house, stretching back into wooded areas where old carriage paths wound between ancient oaks and maples. It was beautiful country, peaceful and seemingly untouched by the violence that had marked its history. But as the afternoon wore on, she found herself drawn back to the house by a restlessness she couldn't quite explain. The journal she'd found in her room the night before continued to haunt her thoughts, its desperate entries about Clara's death and hidden evidence creating an itch of curiosity that demanded scratching. By 4 o'clock, the guests had reconvened in the main foyer for Edward's promised tour of the library, the crown jewel of his restoration efforts. Their host seemed more excited than usual, his eyes bright with anticipation as he led them through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced Victorians. "The library," Edward announced as they reached the familiar oak doors, "represents the heart of any great house. But this particular room—" He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he grasped the brass handles. "This room holds secrets that have waited nearly a century to be revealed." The library was magnificent, 2 stories of rich mahogany shelving climbing toward a coffered ceiling painted with celestial scenes. Tall windows, draped in burgundy velvet, filtered the afternoon light into warm, golden pools, while comfortable reading chairs were arranged near a massive stone fireplace that could have warmed a small cottage. Edward moved immediately to the center of the room, where a reading table held a single open book, a leather-bound volume that looked ancient even in this room full of antiquities. His fingers traced the edge of the page with something approaching worship. "The Marigold Family Chronicle," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "a record spanning nearly 2 centuries of births, deaths, triumphs, and—" He paused, looking up at each of them in turn. "And tragedies that were deliberately concealed from history." Helen felt her pulse quicken as she remembered the journal entries she'd read. Clara Marigold's death in 1925, the suggestions of murder covered up as accident, the references to evidence hidden somewhere on the estate. "I've spent 2 years researching this family's true story," Edward continued, his excitement building with each word. "What I've discovered will shock you. The official records tell us that Clara Marigold died accidentally in 1925, a tragic case of food poisoning. But the family chronicle reveals something far more sinister." Victor shifted uncomfortably near the tall windows. "Edward, why are you telling us this? What does a century-old tragedy have to do with you?" Edward's smile was sharp as a knife edge. "Oh, but it has everything to do with all of you. The secrets that killed Clara Marigold didn't die with her. They've been passed down through generations, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the resources and determination to expose them." May stepped closer to Helen, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Edward, what exactly are you suggesting?" Edward's fingers caressed the ancient pages. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. Facts that will finally bring justice for Clara and reveal a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of our own community." He began to read from the chronicle, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. Details about Clara's investigation into strange deaths, her discovery of evidence that certain prominent families had been involved in covering up murders, her growing fear that she would be silenced before she could expose the truth. The room grew quieter as Edward's narration continued, the afternoon light shifting through the windows to cast longer shadows across the polished floors. Helen noticed that Shadow had positioned himself near the door, while Halo remained close to her side, both dogs displaying the alertness that usually preceded trouble. "The most damning evidence," Edward said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "concerns the south garden. Clara discovered that certain members of her own family had been using it as—" He paused, consulting the chronicle again. "As what she called an unholy cemetery for unholy deeds." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. "I need to verify something in the garden," Edward said suddenly, closing the chronicle with careful precision. "The chronicle references a specific location where Clara hid additional evidence. If I'm right about its location—" He trailed off, his eyes bright with the fever of discovery. "Shouldn't we all go together?" Professor Finch suggested, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of Edward venturing out alone. "No, no," Edward replied, waving away the suggestion. "This requires delicate investigation. Too many people would disturb the site. Please make yourselves comfortable. Examine the other volumes if you wish. There's a fascinating collection of botanical texts on the third shelf. I'll return within the hour with proof that will vindicate Clara's memory and expose the truth about this estate." Before anyone could object further, Edward hurried from the library, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with urgent purpose. The remaining guests exchanged uncertain glances, the atmosphere in the beautiful room suddenly charged with tension and unspoken questions. Helen moved to one of the tall windows, watching as Edward emerged onto the terrace below, and made his way toward the south garden with rapid, determined strides. He carried a small spade and what appeared to be a metal detector, tools that suggested he intended to do more than simply examine the flower beds. "He's obsessed," Victor muttered, settling into one of the leather reading chairs with obvious discomfort. This kind of historical speculation can consume a person's judgment entirely. Camilla had pulled out her sketchbook and was already capturing the library's architectural details with quick, precise strokes. "I think it's romantic," she said without looking up from her work. "Imagine seeking justice for a woman who died nearly a century ago." "I think it's dangerous," May replied quietly, moving to stand beside Helen at the window. "Some secrets are buried for good reasons." They remained in the library for nearly an hour, making polite conversation while stealing glances toward the windows. Professor Finch did indeed examine the botanical texts Edward had mentioned, while Hazel settled into a chair near the fireplace with a cup of tea that Henry had thoughtfully provided. Victor paced restlessly, checking his watch with increasing frequency. It was Camilla who first voiced what they were all beginning to think. Shouldn't he be back by now? Helen had been wondering the same thing. Through the window, she could see the south garden bathed in late afternoon sunlight, but there was no sign of Edward or his excavation activities. "Perhaps we should check on him," Professor Finch suggested, closing the botanical text he'd been pretending to read. They left the library as a group, moving through the house's corridors with the collective unease of people who sensed that something had gone wrong. Henry met them in the main foyer, his usually composed expression creased with concern. "Have you seen Mr. March?" he asked. "He was supposed to meet with the caterers about this evening's dinner, but he hasn't appeared." "He went to the south garden over an hour ago," Helen replied. "Said he was looking for something Clara Marigold had hidden there." Henry's face went pale. "The south garden?" "But no one goes there alone. The soil is unstable in places, and there are old wells that were never properly capped." The group moved quickly through the house and out onto the terrace, following the stone path that led toward the garden where Helen had encountered Thomas Whitmore that morning. The marigolds bloomed as magnificently as ever, their golden faces turned toward the westering sun. But the scene felt different now, ominous rather than beautiful. They found Edward's tools first, the spade and metal detector abandoned beside one of the flower beds, along with a notebook that had fallen open to pages covered with his excited scribbling about measurements and locations. But there was no sign of Edward himself. "Edward!" Victor called, his voice carrying across the garden. "Where are you?" No response came back except the whisper of wind through the hedges. Shadow's hackles rose as they approached the center of the garden, and he began to circle one particular area with obvious agitation. Halo joined him, both dogs focused on a spot where the earth looked recently disturbed. It was Professor Finch who spotted the irregularity in the hedge line, a gap in the carefully maintained boxwood that might have been invisible to casual observation, but was clearly evident to someone looking closely. "There," he said, pointing toward the opening. "Something's wrong with the hedge." They pushed through the gap and found themselves in a small, enclosed space that felt like a secret room carved from living walls. And there, sitting peacefully in an ornate garden chair as if he had simply decided to rest in this hidden sanctuary, was Edward March. But Edward would never rest again. His head was tilted back against the chair's cushioned headrest, eyes closed, mouth slightly open in an expression that might have been mistaken for sleep, if not for the unnatural stillness of his body. His face was peaceful, almost serene, but there was something wrong about the coloring, a faint blue tinge around his lips that spoke of oxygen deprivation. And pinned to his jacket lapel, like a boutonniere chosen for a formal occasion, was a single marigold bloom, its golden petals bright against the dark wool of his jacket. The silence that followed their discovery was profound, broken only by May's sharp intake of breath and the sound of Camilla's sketchbook falling to the ground. "Don't touch anything," Helen said automatically, her investigative instincts overriding her shock. "This is a crime scene." Because whatever had happened to Edward March in this hidden corner of the garden, it had been neither accident nor natural death. The carefully positioned body, the deliberately placed flower, the isolated location, all of it spoke of murder committed with patience and planning. Somewhere in the beautiful gardens of Marigold Hill, a killer walked free among the blooming flowers, having claimed their first victim in what Helen suspected would not be their last strike. The weekend party had become a trap, and Edward March, for all his passionate research into historical crimes, had become the latest entry in the estate's bloody ledger. As Helen looked down at his peaceful face, she realized that Clara Marigold's century-old cry for justice had finally been answered. But the price of that revelation might be higher than any of them had imagined. Chapter 5. Locked Room Open Secrets. The discovery of Edward's body in the hidden garden alcove had transformed the afternoon from scholarly investigation into something far more sinister. The peaceful sanctuary, enclosed by carefully maintained hedges and furnished with an ornate garden chair that suggested it had been designed for quiet contemplation, now felt like a crime scene from a Gothic novel. Mike had taken charge with the quiet authority that Helen had come to appreciate over their months of friendship. He'd positioned himself at the narrow gap in the hedge that served as the only entrance to the hidden space, ensuring no one could disturb the scene while systematically documenting everything with his phone camera. His detective training from his Chicago days was evident in every careful movement, every measured observation. "No signs of forced entry into this space," he said, consulting the notes he'd been making in a small leather notebook. "No obvious weapons, no indication of a struggle. If this is murder, and that flower suggests it is, then we're dealing with someone who had intimate knowledge of both Edward's investigation and this particular location." Helen remained just outside the hedge opening, studying the scene with the focused intensity she usually reserved for particularly challenging baking recipes. Edward sat peacefully in the ornate chair, positioned as if he had simply decided to rest during his garden excavation. But the unnatural stillness of his body, the faint discoloration around his lips, and most tellingly, the fresh marigold bloom pinned to his lapel, told a different story entirely. Shadow lay stretched at her feet, positioned so he could watch both the garden entrance and the path leading back to the house. His breathing was shallow, controlled, the stance of a guardian expecting trouble. Halo had claimed the space between Helen and May, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by an alertness that spoke of instincts older than domestication. "There's something else," Helen said finally, her voice cutting through the nervous whispers that had been building among the other guests. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Edward was lured to this specific location by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Victor Bellamy, who had been pacing near the entrance to the alcove like a caged animal, spun to face her. "What do you mean?" Helen gestured toward the abandoned excavation tools they'd found beside the flower bed. "Edward came here looking for evidence that Clara Marigold had hidden. But look at the dig site, barely a few inches deep, no systematic search pattern." He was interrupted almost immediately after he began. "You're suggesting," Professor Finch said slowly, his academic mind struggling to process the implications, "that someone was waiting for him? That this was a planned assassination?" "I'm suggesting," Helen replied, "that someone knew exactly what Edward would find in that family chronicle, and they made sure he wouldn't have the chance to share it with anyone else." Camilla had gone very still, her sketchbook forgotten in her lap. Her artist's eye, always sharp for detail, was fixed on something the others had missed. "The positioning," she said suddenly. "Edward's body. It's been arranged." Mike looked up from his documentation, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Look at his hands," Camilla continued, pointing with her pencil. "They're folded in his lap, fingers interlaced. That's not how someone sits when they're conducting archaeological work. Someone moved him, positioned him like he was holding court in his garden sanctuary." The observation sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with the cooling afternoon air. Helen studied Edward's peaceful expression, noting details she'd missed in her initial shock. His excavation gloves had been removed and placed neatly on the ground beside the chair. His jacket had been smoothed of wrinkles. Even his hair appeared to have been combed. "Whoever did this," she said quietly, "wanted him to look dignified. That suggests either respect for the dead or a very particular kind of madness." May, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the discussion, finally spoke. "There's another possibility," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if Edward's death was meant to send a message to all of us?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Helen felt the familiar tingle of intuition that told her May had touched on something crucial. "A warning," Helen said, the pieces beginning to coalesce in her mind. "Edward brought us here because he thought we could help him expose the truth about this place. The killer is telling us that some truths are too dangerous to uncover." "But why these specific guests?" Hazel asked, her usual composure cracking to reveal genuine fear beneath. "What do we all have in common that would make us threats?" Helen thought about the invitation she'd received. Edward's careful selection of guests with particular skills and knowledge. Edward invited people who could help validate his research. May understands plants and their properties. Camilla sees details others miss. Professor Finch can research historical records. Victor has connections to local development and politics. She paused, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "I have a reputation for uncovering inconvenient truths." "And you think someone killed Edward to prevent us from helping him?" Mike asked. "I think someone killed Edward because they realized he was closer to the truth than they'd anticipated," Helen replied. "But more than that, I think the killer is still here, among us, watching to see what we do next." Before anyone could respond to this chilling suggestion, Henry Caulfield appeared at the garden entrance, his face pale with anxiety. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "But I've been trying to contact the outside world, and—" He swallowed hard. "All the phone lines have been cut. The internet is down. Even the cellular towers seem to be experiencing some kind of interference." Mike was on his feet immediately. "Are you saying we're completely isolated?" "It appears so," Henry confirmed. "I've checked all the communication systems twice. Someone has systematically disabled our ability to contact the outside world." Helen felt the walls of the trap closing around them. This wasn't just about eliminating Edward. It was about creating the perfect conditions for additional murders. isolated on a remote estate, with no way to call for help. They were completely at the mercy of whoever had orchestrated this weekend's events. "How long would it take someone to walk to town?" Professor Finch asked, clearly thinking about escape routes. 3 hours minimum," Henry replied, "and that's assuming you know the roads well enough to navigate them in darkness. Most of the paths through the woods are unmarked and dangerous after dark." Helen's mind was racing through possibilities and connections. The threatening letters Edward had mentioned, the careful selection of guests, the systematic isolation of the estate. This wasn't the work of an amateur or a crime of passion. It was a carefully orchestrated execution that had been planned for weeks, possibly months. "We need to search the house," she said finally. "If the killer is among us, they'll have left traces. Hidden spaces, surveillance equipment, maybe even additional weapons. Edward invited us here because he thought safety lay in numbers, but numbers only help if we use them wisely." Mike nodded grimly. "We stick together, we watch each other's backs, and we don't trust anyone completely until we know who we're dealing with." As the group prepared to return to the house, Helen took one last look at the hidden garden alcove where Edward sat in peaceful repose. The marigold on his lapel seemed to glow in the fading afternoon light, a beautiful and terrible reminder that some secrets were worth killing for and dying to protect. The weekend party had become something far more sinister than any of them had imagined. But Helen had learned long ago that the only way to defeat a predator was to think like one, to anticipate their moves and stay one step ahead of their plans. Somewhere in the elegant rooms of Marigold Hill, a killer waited to see who would be brave enough, or foolish enough, to continue Edward's investigation. Helen intended to find them before they could claim another victim, but she knew that every step forward brought them closer to either justice or a trap that would claim them all. The game Edward March had started with his weekend party was far from over. In fact, Helen realized with growing certainty it had only just begun. And in this house where marigolds bloomed over old secrets and new graves alike, the final score had yet to be determined. Chapter 6: Clues in the Dark. The decision to search the house came with the understanding that they would be walking into the killer's domain. Mike insisted on dividing into 2 groups. He would take Professor Finch and Victor to examine the main floor and basement areas, while Helen, accompanied by May and Camilla, would investigate the upper floors. Henry would remain in the main foyer, positioned where he could watch all the entrances and coordinate between the 2 search teams. "Stay together, watch each other's backs, and don't touch anything that might be evidence," Mike instructed as they gathered in the grand entrance hall. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows had taken on the golden quality that preceded dusk, casting long shadows across the marble floors and making every doorway seem like a potential hiding place. Helen clipped fresh leashes to Shadow and Halo, noting that both dogs seemed more alert than she'd ever seen them. Shadow's hackles were raised in a line along his spine, while Halo's usual tail-wagging enthusiasm had been replaced by a focused intensity that reminded her he was, beneath the friendly exterior, still a predator bred for hunting. "They'll smell trouble before we see it," she told the group as they prepared to split up. "Trust their instincts." The upper floors of Marigold Hill felt different in the gathering dusk, less welcoming, more watchful. The restored Victorian elegance that had seemed so charming during the morning tour now carried an undercurrent of menace, as if the house itself were holding its breath in anticipation of violence. They began methodically, checking each guest room for signs of disturbance or evidence that someone had been searching through personal belongings. Helen's room appeared untouched, but when she examined it more carefully, she noticed subtle signs that someone had been there. Her overnight bag had been moved slightly, the journal she'd hidden under the mattress was now positioned at a different angle, and the window latch showed fresh fingerprints. "Someone's been watching us," she told May quietly, "going through our things, probably looking for anything that might interfere with their plans." Camilla's room showed similar signs of intrusion, though whoever had searched it had been careful to leave everything appearing normal. Only an artist's eye for detail would have noticed that her sketchbook had been examined, the pages carefully turned to specific drawings, particularly her architectural studies of the house's layout and her character sketches of the other guests. "They were interested in what I'd observed," Camilla said, her voice tight with violation and fear. My drawings of the house, the people, like they were checking to see if I'd noticed something I shouldn't have. May's room yielded the most disturbing discovery. Hidden behind her antique wardrobe, they found a collection of surveillance photographs, long-range shots of each guest arriving at the estate, candid images taken during their morning activities, even pictures of Helen's early morning encounter with Thomas Whitmore in the garden. "Someone's been documenting our every move," May said, studying the photographs with growing alarm. "This isn't spontaneous violence. It's been planned and orchestrated from the moment we arrived." Shadow led them down the main corridor toward the sealed section that Edward had mentioned during his tour. The door that had been marked private during their first day now stood slightly ajar, despite Henry's earlier assurances that this wing was unused and locked. Helen pushed the door open carefully, immediately noticing the stale air that rushed out to meet them. The corridor beyond was dimly lit and poorly maintained, a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the rest of the house. But someone had been using this space recently. Fresh footprints in the dust, modern electrical cables snaking along the baseboards, and the faint hum of electronic equipment operating somewhere in the distance. "This doesn't look abandoned," Camilla observed, her artist's eye noting the incongruities between the shabby appearance and signs of recent activity. They followed the corridor to its end, where a narrow staircase led both up to what had probably been servants' quarters and down toward the basement level. Shadow's nose worked constantly as they climbed, processing information that Helen couldn't access, while Halo remained pressed close to her side with unusual intensity. The third floor revealed a warren of small rooms that had once housed the estate's staff. Most were empty except for dust and old furniture, but one room at the far end showed clear signs of recent occupation. A camp bed had been set up near the window, along with a small table covered with papers, maps, and what appeared to be detailed surveillance notes. Helen examined the documents carefully, her blood chilling as she read entries that tracked each guest's movements, habits, and potential vulnerabilities. The handwriting was neat, precise, and completely unfamiliar, not matching any of the samples she'd seen from the other guests or staff. Lighthall more observant than anticipated. Adjust timeline accordingly. Finch asking too many questions about family records. Monitor closely. Bellamy showing signs of suspicion. May require early elimination. The clinical detachment of the observations was almost more frightening than overt threats. Whoever was behind this was treating murder like a business problem to be solved through careful planning and execution. May discovered something even more disturbing in the room's small closet, a collection of personal items that clearly didn't belong to any current guest. Driver's licenses, jewelry, clothing fragments, all bearing the names and faces of people who had presumably visited Marigold Hill over the years and never left. "Trophies," Helen said quietly, studying a woman's watch that bore an inscription dated 15 years earlier. "This person has been killing visitors to this estate for decades." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just about silencing Edward's historical research. It was about maintaining a killing ground that had been operating for years, possibly generations. The beautiful restored mansion was nothing more than an elaborate trap designed to lure unsuspecting victims into isolation and death. A sound from below made them all freeze, the soft closing of a door, followed by footsteps moving through the corridors beneath them. Someone was in the house, moving with purpose and stealth. Shadow's hackles rose to full alert, and he positioned himself between Helen and the staircase leading down. Halo crowded against May's legs, his body trembling with the effort of restraining his protective instincts. "We need to get back to the others," Helen whispered, but even as she spoke, she heard the unmistakable sound of the door at the bottom of the stairs closing and locking. They were trapped in the servants' quarters with no way down except through a killer who knew they had discovered his secret base of operations. Camilla moved to the window, peering down at the ground 3 stories below. "Too far to jump, and nothing to climb down," she reported quietly. Helen's mind raced through their options. They were trapped in a confined space with evidence of multiple murders, while somewhere below them, a killer moved through the house with the confidence of someone who owned the territory. The surveillance notes suggested he had been watching them all weekend, learning their habits and weaknesses, planning the perfect moment to strike. But they weren't helpless. They had discovered his hiding place, his methods, and most importantly, proof that his crimes extended far beyond Edward's murder. If they could survive long enough to share this information with Mike and the others, they might be able to turn the tables on their tormentor. "The window," Helen said suddenly, studying the room's layout. "Not to escape, but to signal. If Mike's group is searching the lower floors, they might see us." Using Camilla's small mirror from her makeup compact, Helen began reflecting the last rays of afternoon sunlight toward the windows of the main house, creating a pattern of flashes that she hoped would catch Mike's attention. It was a desperate gambit, but their only hope of communicating with the rest of the group. Below them, the footsteps had stopped. The house had gone completely silent, as if even the building itself were holding its breath. In that silence, Helen could hear something that made her blood run cold, the sound of multiple voices coming from the direction of the main foyer, followed by what might have been a scream, quickly muffled. The killer wasn't just stalking them. He was moving against the others, picking off the house party one victim at a time while they remained trapped and helpless to intervene. Shadow growled low in his throat, his attention fixed on the locked door. Halo pressed closer to May, seeking comfort from the fear that radiated from all of them like heat from a fire. Helen continued her desperate signaling with the mirror, sending flashes of light toward every window she could see, praying that someone, anyone, would notice their distress and realize that the weekend at Marigold Hill had become a fight for survival against a predator who had been perfecting his craft for far longer than any of them had imagined. In the distance, she could hear the house's antique bell beginning to toll, not the measured chimes that announced visitors, but the frantic, continuous ringing of an alarm that had come far too late to save anyone. The beautiful restoration of Marigold Hill had been revealed as nothing more than an elaborate stage set for murder, and the final act was about to begin, whether the audience was ready or not. Helen clutched the mirror tighter and continued her desperate signals, knowing that their lives now depended on whether Mike could see her message and understand that they were trapped with evidence that could expose a killer, if they lived long enough to share it. Chapter 7. Motives and Misdirection. The silence that had fallen over Marigold Hill after the distant scream was more terrifying than any sound could have been. Helen continued her desperate mirror signals from the third-floor window, while May and Camilla searched the servants' quarters for anything that might serve as a weapon or another means of escape. The collection of victim trophies they'd discovered painted a horrifying picture of systematic murder, spanning years, possibly decades. Shadow remained positioned at the top of the locked staircase, his body tense with protective energy, while Halo had taken up guard duty at the window, perhaps understanding instinctively that their only hope lay in re-establishing contact with the outside world. "There," Camilla said suddenly, pointing toward the main house. "Second floor, the library windows. Someone's moving around with a flashlight." Helen redirected her mirror signals toward the library, creating a pattern of 3 short flashes, followed by 3 long ones, the universal SOS signal that Mike would recognize from his police training. For several agonizing minutes, there was no response. Then, finally, a brief flash from the library window answered back. "They see us," Helen breathed. "Now we need to tell them what we found." Using the mirror, Helen began a more complex series of signals, spelling out "killer" and "evidence" in basic Morse code that she hoped Mike would remember from his military service. The process was slow and painstaking, requiring multiple repetitions to ensure the message was understood. From the library came a series of acknowledgement flashes, followed by what appeared to be a question signal. Mike was asking for their location and status. "Trapped" and "third floor" took nearly 10 minutes to transmit, but finally the library window went dark. Either because Mike had received the message and was taking action, or because something had happened to prevent him from continuing the communication. "We can't just wait here," May said, her voice tight with frustration. "If someone's picking off the guests one by one, we need to do something." Helen examined the room's sparse furnishings, looking for anything that might give them an advantage. The surveillance notes on the desk provided the most valuable intelligence, detailed observations about each guest's movements, habits, and potential weaknesses. But they also revealed something else, the killer's own patterns and methods. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of entries about security procedures. "He's been disabling the house's communication systems gradually over the past week. Phone lines cut yesterday, internet disabled this morning, cellular jammers activated after we arrived. This whole weekend was designed to be a killing ground with no possibility of outside intervention." Camilla studied her own sketches from earlier in the weekend, comparing them to the architectural notes in the killer's files. "He knows this house better than Edward did. Look, he's marked hidden passages, secret staircases, even old servants' tunnels that weren't included in the restoration plans." May examined the medical supplies she'd found in the killer's kit, sedatives, paralytic agents, and what appeared to be concentrated plant toxins. "This person has extensive knowledge of pharmacology and botany. They're not just killing randomly. They're experimenting with different methods, different approaches." The sound of footsteps on the stairs below made them all freeze. Slow, measured steps that suggested someone climbing deliberately rather than in haste. The killer had returned to his base of operations, perhaps to retrieve additional equipment or to deal with the evidence they'd discovered. Helen quickly gathered the most damning documents from the desk, stuffing them inside her jacket while May and Camilla collected the victim identification materials. If they were going to die, at least the evidence might survive to expose the truth about Marigold Hill's bloody history. The footsteps stopped just outside the locked door. They could hear the soft scrape of a key in the mechanism, followed by the quiet click of the lock disengaging. Shadow's growl filled the small room, low and continuous, while Halo pressed against May's legs with barely controlled fear. "Ladies," a cultured voice called from the stairway, "I know you're there, and I know you found my little museum. Why don't you come down so we can discuss this like civilized people?" Helen recognized the voice immediately, Thomas Whitmore, the mysterious gardener who had warned her away from certain truths on her first morning at the estate. But hearing him speak now, without the carefully maintained rural accent, revealed his true nature, educated, sophisticated, and completely without conscience. "We know who you are," Helen called back, hoping to buy time while Mike organized whatever rescue might be possible. "We know about the victims, the trophies, the systematic murders. The evidence is already in safe hands." "Is it?" Thomas, or whatever his real name was, sounded genuinely amused. "I'm afraid your friend the sheriff is currently indisposed. A small dose of succinylcholine in his afternoon tea has left him temporarily paralyzed but fully conscious. Quite useful for extracting information about police procedures and emergency protocols." Helen's blood ran cold. If Mike was down, they had no backup, no cavalry coming to their rescue. They were truly alone with a killer who had spent years perfecting his methods. "Why?" Camilla asked, her voice stronger than Helen had expected. "Why kill all these people? What could possibly justify decades of murder?" "Justify?" Thomas laughed, the sound carrying a genuine warmth that was somehow more chilling than cold calculation. "My dear girl, I don't need to justify anything. I'm conducting research, studying the intersection of fear, hope, and mortality in controlled conditions. Each guest teaches me something new about human nature under extreme stress." "You're insane," May said flatly. "I'm thorough," Thomas corrected. Edward thought he was so clever, researching the estate's history, gathering evidence about old crimes, but he never realized he was documenting his own death, along with yours. This weekend was designed to provide me with 6 new subjects for study, each with different backgrounds and psychological profiles. Helen felt sick as the full scope of his plan became clear. They hadn't been invited as investigators or potential allies. They were laboratory rats in an elaborate experiment designed to study human behavior under terminal stress. "The family chronicle," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You wrote it, the whole story about Clara Marigold, the historical murders. It was all fiction designed to manipulate Edward." "Very good," Thomas replied approvingly. "Though not entirely fiction. There really was a Clara Marigold, and she really did die in 1925. But she was my first kill, not my last. I've been using her story as bait for decades, luring researchers and historians who thought they could solve a century-old mystery. The revelation was staggering. Thomas wasn't just a serial killer. He was someone who had been operating for nearly 100 years, using the estate as his hunting ground and Clara's death as the foundation for an elaborate deception that had claimed dozens of lives. Impossible! Professor Finch's voice came from the stairway, weak but defiant. No one lives that long. No one maintains that level of consistency. Ah, Professor, Thomas interrupted, still trying to apply logic to a situation that transcends ordinary human experience. You'll learn differently soon enough. Helen heard the sound of something heavy being dragged up the stairs, followed by what might have been muffled protests. Thomas was bringing his other captives to this room for reasons that could only be sinister. But as the minutes passed and more sounds reached them from below, Helen began to notice something that gave her hope. The killer might be supremely confident in his abilities, but he was also operating alone against multiple victims who were now aware of the danger they faced. His plan had depended on surprise and isolation, but both advantages were rapidly disappearing. "He made a mistake," she whispered to May and Camilla. "He's trying to control too many variables at once. Serial killers who operate successfully for decades do so by maintaining strict patterns and avoiding unnecessary risks. But bringing all of us together, trying to manage a group execution, that's outside his normal methods." "What are you suggesting?" May asked. "I'm suggesting that Thomas may be brilliant, but he's also overconfident. He's been playing the same game for nearly a century, and he thinks he knows all the rules. But rules change when people fight back." The sounds from the stairway were getting closer. Thomas was bringing his victims to the killing ground he'd prepared in the servants' quarters, confident that he could maintain control over the situation through superior knowledge and careful planning. But Helen had learned long ago that the most dangerous assumption a predator could make was that their prey would remain passive. Sometimes, the hunted decided to become hunters themselves. And sometimes, in houses where marigolds bloomed over unmarked graves, justice arrived wearing muddy boots and carrying very sharp teeth. Shadow's growl deepened as footsteps approached the door. Halo moved to join him, both dogs positioning themselves to protect their human pack. May picked up a heavy candlestick from the desk, while Camilla armed herself with a metal letter opener. Helen clutched the evidence they'd gathered, knowing that their survival might depend not just on fighting their way out of this room, but on ensuring that Thomas's century-long reign of terror was finally brought to an end. The door began to open, and the final confrontation at Marigold Hill was about to begin. Chapter 8: The Second Strike. The door to the servants' quarters swung open with deliberate slowness, revealing Thomas Whitmore silhouetted against the dim light of the stairwell. He had abandoned any pretense of being a simple gardener. His work clothes had been replaced by dark tactical gear, and he moved with the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable with violence. Behind him, Helen could see the shadowy forms of other figures, the remaining guests, she realized with growing horror, bound and apparently drugged into compliance. Professor Finch's earlier voice from the stairway made sense now. Thomas had been gathering his victims systematically, preparing for some kind of group finale to his weekend experiment. "Please, come away from the window," Thomas said conversationally, as if inviting them to tea rather than threatening their lives. "The evening's entertainment is about to begin, and I'd hate for you to miss it." Shadow's hackles were raised to full alert, his body coiled like a spring ready to launch. Halo pressed against May's legs, his usual friendliness replaced by the focused intensity of a dog who understood that pack survival was at stake. Helen clutched the evidence they'd gathered more tightly, knowing it represented the only chance of exposing Thomas's decades-long killing spree. But she also knew that their immediate survival depended on finding a way out of this trap before Thomas could complete whatever twisted scenario he had planned. "You made a mistake," she said, hoping to buy time while assessing their options. "All this documentation, all these trophies, you've left too much evidence. Even if you kill us all, someone will eventually discover the truth." Thomas smiled, the expression pleasant and completely devoid of warmth. "Will they? I've been refining this process for nearly a century, my dear." Do you really think I haven't considered the problem of evidence disposal? He gestured toward the bound figures behind him. Tonight's finale involves a tragic accident, a gas leak in the old servants' quarters that claims the lives of several guests who were exploring areas of the house they shouldn't have entered. Very sad, very regrettable, but completely explainable. Helen felt her blood chill as she realized the full scope of his plan. Thomas wasn't just planning to kill them, he was going to stage their deaths as an accident that would eliminate all evidence of his crimes while providing a plausible explanation for their disappearance. The basement, Camilla said suddenly, her artist's eye catching details the others had missed. I can smell gas. He's already started the process. The revelation sent a surge of adrenaline through the trapped group. If Thomas had begun flooding the lower levels of the house with gas, they had minutes rather than hours before the building became a death trap for everyone inside. Very perceptive, Thomas agreed approvingly, though I'm afraid it won't help you. The gas is odorized for safety, of course, but the explosion will be quite real. The investigators will find tragic evidence of guests who ignored safety warnings and wandered into dangerous areas of an old house undergoing restoration. May gripped her improvised weapon more tightly. What about Henry? And the other staff members? Henry has already served his purpose, Thomas replied with casual indifference. He provided valuable intelligence about the guests and their potential vulnerabilities, but he was never intended to survive the weekend. As for the other staff, there are no other staff. I've been managing this entire operation alone. The scope of the deception was staggering. Thomas had orchestrated every aspect of their weekend experience, from the elegant meals to the perfectly maintained gardens, all while planning their systematic execution. He was a one-man killing machine who had transformed mass murder into a form of elaborate performance art. But as Helen studied his confident demeanor, she began to notice cracks in his composure. His breathing was slightly elevated. There was a fine tremor in his hands, and he kept glancing toward the stairway, as if expecting interruption. For all his planning and experience, managing multiple live victims was pushing him beyond his comfort zone. You're nervous, she observed. This isn't how you usually operate, is it? All those other victims over the decades, they were individuals, isolated, controllable. But a group like this, people who know they're in danger and can work together, that's outside your normal methodology. Thomas's smile flickered for just a moment. I adapt as circumstances require. Do you? Helen pressed. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're improvising, and improvisation leads to mistakes. As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed from the lower floors of the house, not the expected roar of igniting gas, but something more controlled. Footsteps, moving quickly but carefully through the corridors below. Thomas's head snapped toward the stairway, his carefully maintained composure finally showing genuine concern. Impossible. The sheriff is incapacitated, and there's no one else. His words were cut off by a voice calling from the first floor. Mike's voice, weak but determined. Federal agents! This is a crime scene. Anyone in the building needs to evacuate immediately. Helen felt a surge of hope mixed with confusion. If Mike was conscious and able to move, then Thomas's claims about drugging him might have been exaggerated. But more importantly, the mention of federal agents suggested that help might actually be on the way. Thomas's reaction was immediate and violent. He spun toward the bound figures behind him, pulling a knife from his tactical vest with deadly intent. Change of plans, he snarled. We finish this now. But as he raised the weapon, Shadow launched himself from the floor with the explosive power of a canine missile. The Black Lab's training kicked in, not formal police training, but the deeper instincts of a protector defending his pack. His jaws clamped down on Thomas's wrist with crushing force, sending the knife spinning across the room. The killer's scream of pain and rage filled the small space as he tried to shake off the dog's grip. Halo joined the attack, his usually gentle nature transformed into something primal and fierce as he went for Thomas's legs, bringing the man crashing to the floor. Helen didn't waste the opportunity. She lunged for the scattered evidence while May and Camilla moved to free the bound guests. Professor Finch was conscious but groggy, Victor was barely responsive, and Hazel appeared to be in shock but physically unharmed. "The gas," Professor Finch mumbled, struggling to focus. "He said something about timers, about the whole house." Helen's mind raced through the implications. If Thomas had set timed devices to trigger a gas explosion, they had limited time to evacuate before the building became an inferno. But they also couldn't leave without ensuring that all the evidence of his crimes was preserved. "Can you walk?" she asked the professor, helping him to his feet. "I think so. The drug is wearing off." He gestured toward the surveillance notes scattered across the floor. "Take those. Everything. The authorities need to understand the scope of what this monster has done." Thomas was still struggling with the dogs, his tactical gear providing some protection, but not enough to prevent serious injury. Blood from Shadow's bite was making his grip slippery, while Halo's attack on his legs had left him unable to stand properly. But even wounded and outnumbered, he remained dangerous. Helen could see him reaching for something in his vest, probably another weapon, or perhaps a trigger device for the gas explosion he'd threatened. "Everyone out!" she shouted. "Now!" They moved as a group toward the stairway, supporting the weakened guests, while the dogs maintained their attack on Thomas. The smell of gas was definitely stronger now, rising from the lower floors like an invisible tide of death. As they reached the second floor, Mike appeared at the far end of the corridor, his uniform disheveled, but his bearing still professional. Behind him were two figures in dark suits, who could only be the federal agents he'd mentioned. "Helen! Thank God!" Mike called out. "We need to evacuate immediately. The whole building is compromised." "Thomas Whitmore," Helen gasped as they reached him. "He's been killing people here for decades. The evidence is all upstairs, but he's triggered some kind of gas leak." "We know," one of the federal agents interrupted. "We've been tracking him for months. Marcus Whitmore, also known as Thomas March, also known by at least 6 other identities. We followed a paper trail that led here, but we didn't expect him to escalate to mass murder." The revelation that law enforcement had been closing in on Thomas added another layer to the weekend's events. Had he chosen this particular moment for his grand finale because he knew his time was running out? Was the elaborate house party his attempt to go out in a blaze of glory that would cement his legacy as one of history's most prolific serial killers? They reached the main floor just as Shadow and Halo came bounding down the stairway, both dogs showing signs of their struggle, but apparently uninjured. Behind them, Helen could hear Thomas's voice, no longer the cultured tones of a sophisticated killer, but the raw screams of someone who realized his century-long run had finally come to an end. "The evidence," Helen said, handing the surveillance notes to the federal agent. "He documented everything, decades of victims, methods, even future plans. It's all there." As they burst through the front doors into the cool evening air, Helen could smell the gas even more strongly. Thomas had indeed flooded the building with combustible fumes, turning the restored mansion into a massive bomb waiting for ignition. They had barely reached the safety of the circular drive when the explosion came, not the single devastating blast Thomas had probably planned, but a series of controlled detonations that suggested the federal agents had found and disabled at least some of his triggering devices. The beautiful restoration of Marigold Hill was consumed in minutes, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. But the fire also represented something else: the cremation of a century's worth of secrets, the final destruction of a killing ground that had claimed far too many innocent lives. As Helen watched the mansion burn, she realized that Thomas's greatest fear had been realized. His carefully constructed legacy of terror was being reduced to ash and memory, while the evidence of his crimes lived on in the hands of people who would ensure that justice was finally served. The weekend at Marigold Hill had ended exactly as Thomas had planned, in fire and death and the destruction of secrets. But the truth had survived, and that truth would make sure that his victims were finally remembered for who they were, rather than how they died. Standing in the glow of the burning house, surrounded by the people she'd helped save and the agents who would carry forward the investigation, Helen felt the complex satisfaction that came with seeing justice triumph over evil. even when that justice arrived with singed hair and the scent of smoke. Chapter 9. The Truth in Bloom. The federal agents had set up a makeshift command center in the estate's gardening shed, one of the few outbuildings that had escaped the flames that consumed Marigold Hill. Generator-powered floodlights cast harsh white circles across what had once been Edward March's carefully restored gardens, now a chaotic landscape of emergency vehicles, evidence teams, and smoking rubble. Helen sat on a stone bench that had somehow survived the destruction, wrapped in a Red Cross blanket and watching the controlled chaos unfold around her. Shadow and Halo lay at her feet, both dogs exhausted from their confrontation with Thomas, but alert enough to track the movements of the federal agents who continued to arrive throughout the night. Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI's lead investigator, approached with a steaming cup of coffee and the grim expression of someone who had spent decades pursuing serial killers, but had never encountered anything quite like this case. "How are you holding up?" she asked, settling beside Helen on the bench. "Better than I expected," Helen replied honestly, "though I suspect the full impact hasn't hit me yet." "It never does, not immediately." Chen consulted her tablet, which glowed with crime scene photos and preliminary reports. "We've secured Thomas Whitmore. His real name is Marcus Whitmore, by the way. He's being treated for the dog bites at County General under heavy guard." Helen felt a surge of pride as she looked down at Shadow and Halo. They probably saved all our lives tonight. They definitely did. But what I'm about to tell you might change how you think about this entire case. Chen's voice carried the weight of someone delivering news that would fundamentally alter the listener's understanding of reality. Mike approached from the direction of the command center, his uniform still rumpled from the night's events, but his bearing professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. He carried a thick file folder and wore the expression of someone who had been reviewing evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about the case. "Helen," he said, settling on her other side, "we need to talk about what we've learned about Thomas, about Marcus, about this whole operation." "What do you mean?" Helen asked, though she could already sense from their expressions that another revelation was coming. Agent Chen opened her tablet to a series of photographs, police mugshots, driver's licenses, and passport photos spanning several decades. Marcus Whitmore is 47 years old. He was born in 1976, which means he couldn't possibly have killed Clara Marigold in 1925. Helen felt the familiar tingle of understanding that preceded a major breakthrough in her investigations. Then who did? "His grandfather," Mike replied, opening the file folder to reveal a collection of historical documents and family photographs. "Thomas Whitmore Sr., born 1899, died 1967. He was indeed the groundskeeper at Marigold Hill in the 1920s, and our preliminary research suggests he was responsible for Clara's death and at least 6 other murders during his tenure here." Chen took over the narrative, her voice clinical, but not without emotion. "The killing didn't stop with Thomas Sr. His son, Marcus Whitmore, our current suspect's father, continued the tradition from roughly 1960 until his death in 1995. And then the current Marcus took over, maintaining the family business for nearly 30 years. The scope of the revelation was staggering. Helen tried to process the implications of a multi-generational conspiracy that had been using Marigold Hill as a hunting ground for almost a century. 3 generations, she said quietly. A family business built on murder. "It gets worse," Agent Chen continued. "Each generation refined the methods, improved the techniques, expanded the victim pool. Thomas Sr. was crude. He mostly killed locals and relied on his position as groundskeeper to cover his tracks. Marcus Sr. was more sophisticated. He began targeting researchers and historians who might uncover inconvenient truths. And the current Marcus..." She paused, consulting her notes. "He turned it into a form of performance art." Mike leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "The federal investigation has been tracking him for 2 years, following a pattern of disappearances connected to historical research projects. Genealogists, archivists, amateur historians, people who were investigating old family records or property histories, they'd vanish without a trace, always in rural areas, always while pursuing research that might have led them to Marigold Hill. Edward wasn't the first, Helen realized. He was just the latest in a long line of researchers who got too close to the truth. Exactly. And Marcus had perfected the process of using their own research against them. He would monitor their work, sometimes for months, feeding them just enough information to keep them interested while learning about their methods, their contacts, their support systems. Then, when they were isolated and vulnerable, he would strike. Agent Chen showed Helen another series of photographs, these ones recovered from Marcus's hidden archives in the destroyed house. We estimate he personally killed at least 37 people over the past 3 decades. Combined with his father's and grandfather's victims, the Whitmore family has been responsible for over 100 murders spanning nearly a century. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. Helen thought about all the families who had wondered what happened to their missing loved ones, all the research projects that had ended in unexplained disappearances, all the truths that had been buried along with their discoverers. How did they get away with it for so long? She asked. Careful victim selection, Mike replied. They never killed locally, never targeted people with strong community ties or high-profile careers. They chose transients, loners, people whose disappearances could be explained away or attributed to the nomadic nature of historical research work. And they were patient, Chen added. Sometimes Marcus would spend a year or more cultivating a potential victim, learning their habits, earning their trust, positioning himself as a helpful local contact. When they finally disappeared, he was often one of the last people to see them alive, but as a concerned helper rather than a suspect. Helen remembered her first encounter with Thomas, Marcus, in the garden, how he had seemed protective of the estate, knowledgeable about its history, genuinely concerned about preserving its secrets. It had been a masterful performance, one that drew on decades of practice in manipulation and deception. The weekend party, she said, understanding flooding through her. It wasn't about eliminating Edward's research. It was about creating the ultimate experiment, a controlled environment where Marcus could study group dynamics under terminal stress. He documented everything, Agent Chen confirmed. We found video equipment, psychological assessment forms, even what appeared to be a research proposal for some kind of academic paper about human behavior in extreme situations. He genuinely believed he was conducting valuable scientific research. Using murder as his methodology, Mike said grimly. Professor Finch approached their group, moving slowly but under his own power. His experience with Marcus's drugs had left him weak but lucid, and his academic mind was already working to process the historical implications of what they'd uncovered. The family records, he said, settling carefully onto the grass near their bench. If Marcus inherited this operation from his father and grandfather, there must be extensive documentation going back decades. Victim lists, methodology notes, maybe even correspondence between the generations. We're hoping to find exactly that, Chen replied. Marcus's computers were destroyed in the fire, but we're optimistic that he maintained off-site backups. People who commit crimes on this scale tend to be obsessive about record-keeping. May and Camilla emerged from the medical tent, where they'd been receiving treatment for smoke inhalation and psychological trauma. Both women looked exhausted but determined, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who had survived something terrible and were now committed to ensuring it never happened again. Any word on Victor? May asked as she joined the group. Stable, Mike replied. The knife wound was serious but not life-threatening. He'll make a full recovery, though he'll be dealing with the psychological impact for a long time. We all will, Camilla said quietly. She pulled out her sketchbook, somehow salvaged from the chaos of their escape, and opened it to a page covered with detailed drawings of Marcus during their confrontation. I kept drawing throughout the whole ordeal. Habit, I suppose, but these might be useful for the investigation. Agent Chen examined the sketches with professional interest. Very useful. We'll want to include these in our case file. Visual documentation from a witness perspective is invaluable. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Helen found herself studying the ruins of Marigold Hill. The beautiful restoration that Edward March had poured his heart and fortune into was now nothing more than blackened timbers and collapsed stone. But she realized that its destruction was also a kind of liberation. The house had been a monument to deception and death, and its burning had finally freed the secrets it had harbored for so long. "What happens now?" she asked Agent Chen. "Now we do the work," Chen replied. "We identify every victim, notify every family, document every crime. We trace the Whitmore family's activities back to the beginning and ensure that their entire criminal enterprise is exposed to the light. Marcus will spend the rest of his life in federal prison, and his family's legacy will be remembered for what it really was. Not romanticized folklore about mysterious disappearances, but the documented history of serial murder spanning 3 generations." "And the estate?" "The property will be seized as proceeds of criminal activity. Ultimately, it will probably become a memorial to the victims, a place where their names can be remembered and honored instead of hidden and forgotten." Helen stood slowly, feeling the weight of exhaustion and adrenaline crash settling into her bones. "I keep thinking about Clara Marigold. She tried to expose this evil 90 years ago, and she died for it. If people had listened to her then." "You can't think that way," May said gently. "Clara did what she could with the knowledge and resources available to her. You did what you could with yours. The important thing is that it's finally over." But Agent Chen shook her head. "Actually, this investigation is just beginning. Now that we understand the scope of the Whitmore family's crimes, we need to reopen dozens of cold cases, review hundreds of missing person reports, and probably exhume remains from locations across multiple states. This could take years to fully resolve." As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and illuminating the full scope of the destruction, Helen realized that her role in this case was ending, just as law enforcement's was beginning. She had done what she did best, uncovered the truth, exposed the deception, and survived long enough to ensure that justice could be served. But the real work, the painstaking process of giving names back to the nameless victims, of providing closure to grieving families, of ensuring that the full scope of the Whitmore family's crimes was documented and remembered, that would fall to others. Shadow stretched and yawned beside her, while Halo rolled over to expose his belly to the warming sun. Both dogs seemed to understand that the immediate danger had passed, though they remained alert to the continued presence of law enforcement personnel moving through the crime scene. "Ready to go home?" Mike asked, appearing beside her with car keys in hand. Helen took one last look at the smoking ruins of Marigold Hill, where marigolds had once bloomed over unmarked graves, and a family of killers had perfected the art of turning beauty into horror. The flowers were gone now, consumed in the same flames that had destroyed the house, but their memory would live on as a reminder of how evil could hide behind the most innocent facades. "Yes," she said finally, "I'm ready to go home." As they walked toward Mike's truck, Helen reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from a peaceful retirement in her cottage to the center of one of the most complex serial killer cases in American history. She had come to Marigold Hill expecting nothing more challenging than a weekend of intellectual discussion and perhaps some mild social drama. Instead, she had helped expose a century-long conspiracy of murder and deception, saved the lives of her fellow guests, and ensured that the victims of 3 generations of killers would finally receive the justice and recognition they deserved. The road ahead stretched toward home, toward her quiet cottage and her peaceful garden, where the only secrets were which vegetables would thrive in the coming season. But Helen knew that peace would be temporary, as it always was. Somewhere out there, another mystery was probably already taking shape, another truth waiting to be uncovered by someone brave enough or stubborn enough to ask the right questions. And when that time came, she would be ready, along with Shadow and Halo, her faithful companions in the endless quest for justice, in a world where evil often wore beautiful masks and truth required courage to expose. The Whitmore family's reign of terror was finally over, but the work of remembering their victims and honoring their stories was just beginning. And that, Helen thought as they drove away from the smoldering ruins of Marigold Hill, was exactly as it should be. Epilogue. 3 weeks after the events at Marigold Hill, Helen Lighthall sat in her favorite armchair by the kitchen window, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold on the side table beside her. The late October afternoon light filtered through her lace curtains, casting gentle shadows across the worn hardwood floors of her cottage. Everything was exactly as she had left it before that fateful weekend. The same cheerful yellow walls, the same ceramic canisters lined up on the counter, the same sense of peaceful domesticity that had defined her retirement. Yet somehow everything felt different. Shadow lay stretched across the braided rug near the back door, his dark coat gleaming in the slanted sunlight. He seemed more alert these days, as if their experience at the estate had reminded him that comfort and safety were not permanent conditions, but gifts to be guarded carefully. Halo had claimed his usual spot on the kitchen floor, belly up in a patch of warm sun, but even in sleep he seemed more subdued than before. The local newspaper lay folded on the table beside her chair, its front page dominated by headlines about the ongoing investigation at Marigold Hill. 23 victims had been identified so far, with more expected as forensic teams continued their work. Marcus Whitmore had been declared competent to stand trial, though his defense attorneys were already suggesting a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Helen had declined all interview requests, preferring to let the victims and their families occupy the spotlight rather than the woman who had helped expose their killer. But she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, another mystery was already taking shape. It was the nature of evil to adapt, to find new hiding places when old ones were exposed. Shadow lifted his head and looked directly at her, his dark eyes holding the patient wisdom of a creature who understood that rest was temporary, but vigilance was eternal. Helen smiled and reached down to pat Shadow's head. "How long do you think we have?" she asked softly. "A month? A week? Until tomorrow's mail brings another invitation we can't refuse?" Shadow's tail thumped once, his version of a philosophical shrug. In his experience, mysteries arrived when they arrived, and worrying about the timing only shortened the peaceful moments in between. Outside, the autumn wind scattered the last leaves from her maple tree, carrying them away like messages seeking their intended recipients. Somewhere among those dancing leaves, Helen thought, might be the seeds of her next adventure. But for now, there was tea to finish, dogs to pet, and the simple pleasure of being home and safe and surrounded by love. At least until the next mystery came knocking.